Hi everyone! Welcome back to another history lesson with me, Miss Horn. We have been looking at nationalism in Europe during the 19th century, and we are going to continue that here today with the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, and also the Russian Empire. So, a few of the people that we're going to talk about today is Franz Joseph. He is the Habsburg Emperor of the dual monarchy. You have Frederick Diak, who is a Hungarian leader who actually proposed the idea of a dual monarchy between Austria-Hungary. And then, we're actually going to look at what this dual monarchy is. And basically, it was an agreement that made Austria-Hungary different states, but ruled by the same emperor. And they would also have different constitutions and different parliaments, but their Ministry of Finance, Defense, and Foreign Affairs would all be the same. We're also going to talk about the Young Turks, and we're also going to talk about Nicholas II, first and second, the Tsars of Russia. So, the question really is, how did the desire for national independence among ethnic groups weaken and ultimately destroy the Austrian and Ottoman empires? Well, these two empires actually ruled very ethnically diverse groups of people. And as nationalist feelings grew among these groups, the power of the empires overall declined. Now, what you should remember is at this point in time, you had a patchwork of different nationalities, like under the same umbrella groups. And between 1800 and 1904, you start to see the lines be drawn firmly in the sand, so to speak. So nationalists would start pushing for self-rule, and this would bring on the decline. Now, during the early 1800s, the Habsburgs would actually prevent change, or tried to anyway, and they ignored liberal demands. The Habsburgs, the Austrians, didn't really allow industrialization because they feared that that would challenge the empire's traditional way of life. But despite their efforts, industrialization came in the 1840s, and this caused a lot of changes, including the growth of cities. So, the mid 1800s saw this very diverse group of people with rival goals of the Habsburgs in the Austrian government. So these national feelings began to grow, and then these nationalists began to demand certain things of the Habsburg rulers, like a self-determined government. And when that didn't happen, because the Habsburgs were like, nah, it ain't gonna happen, revolts broke out in 1848 that would eventually crush the Habsburg government. So on the Hungarian side, the Hungarians wanted to actually rule over themselves. And you had this 18-year-old during the uprisings in 1848 who actually inherited the Habsburg throne, and he would continue to rule until 1916. So this new emperor in Hungary made some reforms that included the formation of a legislature. This did not satisfy Hungarians, however, because the body was still led by German-speaking Austrians, and they wanted their own voice in government. So with the help of Nicholas I, the Tsar of Russia, he aided the Hungarians in a revolt against the Austrians. And the Austrians' defeat in this war actually allowed Hungarians to pressure the Habsburgs for a compromise. So, Frederick Diak actually formed a solution called the dual monarchy in 1867. Now, the dual monarchy, you would see that they would be separate because they would each have their own constitution and own parliament, but Franz Joseph would actually rule over both of these territories. He would be the Emperor of Austria and the King of Hungary. And They would share, as I mentioned before, ministries of defense, finance, and foreign affairs. However, despite this compromise, nationalists were still not having it, and they continued to increase their unrest throughout the empire. So Hungarians were happy, but others were not. The Slavic people in the territory were still angry that they lacked a voice in the government. So nationalist leaders called on them to unite. And this unrest would ultimately paralyze governments into the early 1900s. So the Ottomans faced similar problems. So they were a multinational empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to Northern Africa and the Middle East. And many revolts would break out in the Ottoman Empire in the 1800s as these nationalist groups began to form. And some states actually ended up getting their independence by 1878. That would be, Montenegro, you had Serbia, Romania, and Greece. And the Ottomans faced many challenges from the outside as well, because European powers considered the Ottoman Empire like the lesser than empire. So they called them the sick man of Europe. So Russia would push down south to Istanbul in the Black Sea. Austria-Hungary would take control of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and France and Britain would actually eye Ottoman lands in the Middle East and into northern Africa. And this is where you have the Crimean War, break out. So the Ottomans were actually denying the rights of worship to Orthodox Christians in Crimea. So the Russians invaded these Ottoman territory. And now Great Britain and France actually joined the Ottoman Empire in its fight against Russia. And the war would last for 2 years, and absolutely nothing was accomplished from it. What it did do was that it increased the rivalries in the Balkans, which led to conflicts. Russia would fight several wars against the Ottomans, and the older powers of Europe would take sides. And that subjected people to revolts, and they would fight amongst themselves, and the Balkans just became a powder keg. Just imagine being able to cut the tension with a butter knife. They were just looking for any reason whatsoever to just start going at each other and fighting. And that's what would ultimately lead to World War I, is that the Balkans were just waiting for a reason to go all out war on somebody. Now, with the Ottomans, you also saw the Young Turks in 1908. They are a nationalist group that began to revolt against the absolute power of the Sultan. And the Sultan was forced to restore the constitution of the area. Now, you still had the Balkan Wars going on at this time. So 2 wars in particular would break out right before World War I. You had in 1912 and 1913, and this would ultimately cost the Ottoman Empire most of their territory and force them out of Europe. And the Balkans would remain this powder keg. And then ultimately later on, when communism collapsed and brought war back to the Balkans in the 1990s, as Yugoslavia broke up into 5 different nations, which we'll talk about that a little later. Now, on the Russian front, you know that Russia controls most of the land from Europe into Asia, and as a result, there are many different ethnic groups within the Russian Empire. Now, the Tsars, the emperors, had absolute power, and they opposed the Enlightenment. Sans our enlightened absolute ruler, which was Catherine and her, predecessor Paul. But other than that, there was little industrialization that went into Russia. They were mostly agriculture, and they were filled with serfs. Now, the ideas of reform started to spread into Russia via Decembrists. They tried to gain reforms, but they were ultimately captured and sent to Serbia by Nicholas I, where they would never be seen again, because Serbia is, a tundra and stupid cold. Then you also started to see mandates put in place to attack Jewish people, and these were called pogroms. And this is who they would decide to blame all of Russia's problems on. And every other country throughout all of history, they start blaming Jewish people for things they never even did. So Nicholas II, or Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia, would be the last Tsar. And we'll finish off Nicholas when we talk about the Russian Revolution. But right now we're going to talk about the fact that he tried to industrialize Russia. He actually opened the Trans-Siberian Railroad. In 1904, he actually led a conflict with Japan, and this would be the most embarrassing loss for Russia. And this would send shockwaves throughout Russia. Because in January 22nd of 1905, you would have what's called Bloody Sunday. Now, this would be a peaceful group of peasants and workers that were led by a priest. They were all unarmed. They walked to the Tsar's palace with demands for reform. The Russian troops panicked and started firing into the crowd, killing hundreds, if not thousands. It's suspected that anywhere from 96 all the way up to 4,000 plus people perished as a result of this panic. This sent shockwaves through Russia, which led to mass strikes and actually a rebellion against the Tsar. Peasants also began to rebel against landlords. Students would protest in the streets. It was just all around bad. So, Nicholas was forced to issue what's called the October Manifesto, where he promised a constitution, he promised to give individual liberties, and to establish the Duma. The Duma was a parliament, basically. Same thing as England had, they were trying to set up in Russia. Now, this did appease the people for a while, until Nicholas was like, yeah, no, I'm taking back those reforms, and I'm closing the Duma and telling everybody to go home. Probably not a great idea. He probably should have seen Bloody Sunday as an omen, because him closing the Duma would ultimately lead to long-term problems. People wanted their voices to be heard, and they began to realize that the problem was with the monarchy. And we know where that goes from there, right? Right. So this is an image of Nicholas II and images of Bloody Sunday. It's pretty graphic. Now, one of the interesting things that I like to leave off, or I like to leave this unit with, is this. So we are moving into World War I. That is our next unit. That is our next subject to talk about. And the interesting thing to keep in mind is that World War I was quite literally a family affair. All of those involved in World War II, those heads of states, were grandchildren of Queen Victoria of England. In Great Britain, you had King George V. In Russia, you had Tsar Nicholas II. And in Germany, you had Kaiser Wilhelm II. And apart from that, the heads of state in Sweden, Norway, Spain, Belgium,